Starting again. Hi, welcome. I'm joined by Alan, and we're going to talk a little bit about the future. Alan and I met a few days ago when we were on a server discussing some of the problems that were connected with the pandemic and some of the challenges that we were facing. Uh, and as a society, not just him and I. We were talking about the pressures that were being put on people, the problems of climate change, the geopolitical issues, the economic issues, and that sort of thing. And it wasn't just the two of us. There were about, I would say, 20 people inside that chat. And yeah, no, it got very heated, didn't it, Alan?
Yeah, absolutely. And you didn't introduce yourself, so this is Jawad with us. And so it was really interesting, the negative feedback and the backlash that we seem to get for even just suggesting the idea of what they described as rats jumping ship.
And it wasn't rats jumping the ship. We just pointed out that a lot of these problems were essentially problems of not having enough resources, in terms of energy or in terms of rare earth materials or in terms of anything else that you could think of, and that actually if we just were able to, say, get to the moon or to get to other parts of the solar system, we could do things like mine asteroids and, get as much energy as we needed, say, from the sun, right? And that seemed like a pretty reasonable thing, like from my point of view, and I think your point of view. And and they seem to balk at the idea that we would be able to, go to space and be able to solve at least some of our problems, if not all of our problems, in that way. And then we pointed out to them that, yeah, actually, if you're talking about, having space infrastructure, it wasn't a pipe dream that was going to happen like, oh, I don't know, 300 or 400 years into the future, that we were actually had most, if not all, of the tech that we needed to get started straight away.
Not only that, but that we've already started. These technologies are already in the process of coalescing, because like even today we had the what are the names? Jeb and Doug, the astronauts from SpaceX, landing back from the International Space Station here back in the United States. And that's a private entity putting people into space off of American soil for the first time in something like, is it 20 years now? It's just, these technologies do exist and they're out there. It's the incentive and the drive of the people to actually pursue them that seems to be lacking.
Yeah, and actually that's very true. But quite recently, we've seen a huge surge in the amount of tech that was always promised to us, suddenly actually materializing day to day. Tesla, for example, has brought the electric car out of a niche market very much into the mainstream. And, we're now seriously considering having self-driving cars. Our solar panels are way, way better than they were, at any time in the past. Our battery technology is improving massively, but we're massively hampered and constrained by, say, the amount of nickel that we're able to mine for batteries, or lithium that we, want to mine for our batteries, just because there's only so much of it actually here on Earth, right?
And not to mention that fact, but not only is there not as much of it as we would need readily accessible here on Earth, it's the fact that by going out and actually retrieving it and manufacturing it and processing it here on Earth, you have to use up energy that's already coupled into the system, therefore reducing the efficiency of the process. And you have to pollute the atmosphere and the planet while you do those processes to make the world better. In the same way that lithium-ion batteries may be really good for electric cars, which are really good for the environment, but the process to make those batteries is not.
So rather than like going through and repeating mistakes or trying to, affect a massive amount of political change on Earth and doing that stuff, I was thinking, you know what? It would just be better if we had, like, I don't know, self-sustaining space stations, or, a space elevator, say up on the moon or elsewhere. And yeah, I mean that particular chat that we were in the other day, kind of petered out as you and I were like talking about, the various options and stuff, and the objections suddenly evaporated. And that very much happened because, it is a very promising view of the future. It's a very positive view of the future, but it's also a very realistic view of the future. And after that conversation, we continued to talk, we continued to get to know each other a bit better, and we thought it might be good to carry on the conversation and at least like set out some of our ideas for what is possible, what is actually feasible with our technology today. And especially given like all the pessimism that is going on in the world with coronavirus, I thought it might be a really useful thing to give people, an idea,
something to look forward to.
Yeah, and a glimpse into something that's actually practical that we can do that will take humanity forward a step. And no, I'm very grateful that we have a chance to do this. So yeah, I think we want to do it not just in like a 1 hour conversation, because it's not really going to be possible to cover everything. But definitely, I think we can set out the kind of things that we want to discuss, and maybe take us to where we want to be in talking about a lot of different things. I mean, Alan,
absolutely.
Go ahead.
Because the intricacies of these different processes and these different technologies, I could lay out a list in front of you and tell you, okay, these are the things we need, but that won't tell you how we're going to get there and how those technologies work together to give us other technologies. And that information is what the public seems to be lacking. They don't know how to tie all these magical monstrosity technologies together that are put up in outer space because they don't have anything to compare it to down here on the ground. And I think if we lay out a logical and ordered list of things that can be done and can be done in correlation with one another, it would help to dispel some of the negative connotations we have towards solar expansion.
Yeah, I mean, most of our solar expansion ideals, most of the work that's been done has been primarily done by governments, right? We're talking about the NASA program, which actually put people on the moon. And one of the great benefits of that was, although it was essentially a competition between Russia and the United States, when the United States won and we actually saw somebody step onto the moon, it was the most magical, universal, uniting moment in history. It was something that defined an entire generation. And I think we have that to look forward to when we say set up a proper moon base, or when we say step foot on Mars, or we start colonizing the outer parts of the solar system. There is genuinely a wonderful, bright future out there for us. And I think we'll talk a bit about that in like upcoming episodes. So I don't know, Alan, I mean, where do you think we should start talking about it?
Well, so the most logical place to start is right here at home, right in our own orbit, near Earth orbits, and maybe slightly out to maybe geostationary. Different infrastructure that you can place in like those kinds of points that will be beneficial to us down here on the ground today, that will start turning at least small profit margins back so that we can continue to expand outwards. And those kind of infrastructure look like things like space stations, different options for space stations. You have robotics and telecommuting where you can build those same space stations in orbit around with robots, with nobody up there, nobody risking their lives in the vacuum and radiation space, in the same way that we fly drones halfway across the planet from ourselves. You could use mirrors, lasers for communication, information, and even like heating things up for processing materials in space or on the ground by focusing energy backwards so that that energy is in a more compact area to be used here on Earth to generate things like electricity or manufacturing processes.
I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that would be brilliant. I mean, one of the things you mentioned there was space stations. We already have a space station, the International Space Station, up there. But it's very much, I would say, a proof of concept, and it's been up there for decades, and it's definitely, proven that we are able to send people up into space and keep them there, and actually we have gotten an enormous amount of scientific benefit from it. But the kind of thing that I'm interested in is us being able to create, say, self-sustaining space stations, right? And
Yeah,
yeah,
and that's the key. And we don't even need self-sustaining space stations at this stage. We just need something slightly larger that we can have more facets of uses for, such as rotating habitat stations, where you can have a docking port in the middle. You can have different rings overlaid on top of one another that have different types of gravity for testing out. Like, you could have one for lunar gravity, one for Martian gravity, Earth gravity, Venusian gravity. And that way we can figure out how humans and how plants and animals will react to those different types of gravities, or even get people ready to go to those places before we get there by introducing them to their new environment.
that's it, exactly. Yeah, and so we've got, for example, in the ISS space station, it doesn't rotate, there's no gravity on it at all. And what we've found is that people suffer from a lack of gravity. They lose muscle tone, they have problems with their vision, they have a lot of issues that crop up. But it turns out that if you take, a space station and you spin it, and not even particularly fast, then that force that you get, centripetal force, actually acts like gravity. So, yeah, the concept that you're describing of a space station that spins and that has different concentric rings on it, it might seem far-fetched, but if you remember that that's something that's not exactly new. Like, we had it all the way back in like Space Odyssey 2001, where it's Stanley
Well,
Kubrick.
well, I would beg to argue that that technology can go all the way back to the invention of the wheel. These technologies aren't anything that are crazily interesting or new or terrifying and like add new concepts to reality. It's just simply taking old technology, or even slightly newer technology made up of old technology, and combining it again to make something even more advanced.
And I think that's probably going to be a big theme. Like, what I love about talking about this is that we're not talking about science fiction. We're talking about fact, right? And we're talking about pure fact. We're talking about things that we are very well aware of. We know how centripetal force works, right? And we know how gravity is possible from, spinning something and actually standing on the edges of it. In fact,
Right.
if you go to a fairground, there are these rides where you stand up against the wall and they spin it really quickly, and you can actually feel yourself being pushed back. It's kind of an exciting feeling. But if you imagine that spinning slower and much, much, much larger, then you can actually stand up on it rather than, say, being pushed back into the wall, and you can actually walk around. And we're talking about things which are kilometers in diameter. So you could have houses there, you could have weather there, you could have, sunlight coming in from gaps inside the cylinder, which effectively it would be a giant cylinder in space. But again, I think
Right.
we're far
Absolutely.
off. I think we're far off doing that quite yet. And I think, yeah, as you say, we've got to get space stations. We've got to get robotics and automation up there, so we don't have to do all the work. We need to get telecommunications sorted out. And yeah, I think you mentioned mirrors, I think, and lasers, or you were going to.
Yeah, the mirrors and lasers that we can put into orbit now, or even ground-based lasers and reflectors, we can use those as propulsion, or
Hmm.
essentially our own artificial solar winds of light to push things around the solar system, so that we can start a speedy exploration of the entire solar system for very little fuel, because light doesn't take hardly any energy away from it to get out of our gravitational field.
That's right. Yeah, no, that sounds fantastic. I know that Stephen Hawking was a big supporter of a project to be able to send probes from our solar system to Proxima Centauri by pushing them on solar sails with lasers. And that sounds like a crazy idea, but quite recently, actually, yesterday, there was an article saying that if they created those particular probes out of very light foam, which was very, very durable, that they could cut down the time it takes to travel from here to Proxima Centauri, which is 4 light years away, to 185 years, which is astonishing, considering that the Voyager probes, using technology back in the 1960s, would take about 73,000 years to reach that kind of distance. So, I mean, it's not like we haven't made progress recently, but I think, yeah, that's something we can talk about maybe in the next episode. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about like where we'll be going after we've discussed that?
Yeah, absolutely. And jumping away from near Earth orbit infrastructure, or what is called orbital infrastructure, we go on to lunar infrastructure. And that's things like the lunar gateway, the stepping stone to Mars, lunar facilities, lunar manufacturing facilities. And even with today's technology, we could build a completely traditional steel-made lunar space elevator where you can use essentially counterweights and electricity by bringing things to Luna and taking things away from Luna at the same time for no energy to get things into orbit with almost no energy and fuel, or at least greatly diminished energy and fuel. So you don't need combustible actual rockets to get up out of the very minute gravitational well that is around Luna, as opposed to Earth, where it takes tons and tons and tons of fuel to carry tons and tons of fuel to carry a couple kilos of payload.
Yeah, our biggest problem, I think, of getting out of our gravity well was the cost per kilo. It takes an enormous amount of rocket fuel, an enormous amount of engineering power to take even the smallest of satellites into space, let alone whole people into space. So it makes sense that we would try and find a way of reducing that cost. People like Elon Musk, and actually a lot of the work done by NASA and a lot of the work done by space agencies across the world, have been steadily grinding that, cost down to the point where they're able to send up bigger and bigger satellites more and more often. And you're absolutely right. Like, once we get out of our relatively strong gravity well up into space, I don't think people realize just how much of a difference it's going to make. I mean, so many things will be so much easier. And yeah, the moon is the perfect place to start, right?
Right, absolutely. And the moon isn't necessarily a place to start, it's the place to get the resources to start. What comes after lunar infrastructure, like I mentioned, lunar mining and lunar manufacturing, you end up being able to build things like true spaceships. And back here on Earth, to get people to space, to get to those spaceships and those space stations, you have SSTOs, you have freight transport. These are all key critical infrastructure that has to be in place for us to be able to go forward past just our dual planetary system.
I was just wondering, what does SSTO stand for?
Oh, so SSTO is the single stage to orbit, which essentially means you can take a traditional plane and take off from a runway just like a normal plane, fly up, make a couple loops, get really high up in the atmosphere, and then they use an origami style folding method inside the jet engines to turn them from traditional jet engines into ramjet engines, which ram air into it to make it more powerful and efficient in low oxygen atmosphere. And you can use that to get up to the higher elevations of atmosphere. And then you can engage traditional rocket engines that are essentially your payload, along with the people that you're taking into space. Fly that directly up out of the atmosphere and then get into orbit, low Earth orbit, dock with one of these space stations. The people get off of the SSTO, walk around the space station, spend a little time there, just like an airport. The SSTO then can detach from the space station, fly back to Earth, and then land through traditional means by re-entering through the atmosphere, spinning in a big circle and coming down and landing back at the airport, then to be refueled, refurbished, and then resent up into space with a new payload of people. And then the people from the space that are now on the space station can then go across the space station, get in the next terminal, and hop on a true spaceship. And true spaceships are different than SSTOs or even the rockets that we take off with now, because they don't have any re-entry method. Most of them are on a fixed course, so they don't ever slow down and actually dock with space stations. You'll get in something like a transport module that will take you and intercept the true spaceships that are, if you're going from Earth to Luna, they're going in a constant, somewhat of a figure eight between Earth and Luna, back and forth. And now you don't have to speed up and slow down that big, giant, bulking true spaceship. You just have to speed up the little transport ship and get to it, dock with it, and then send your people over into it, undock with it, and fly the transport ship back to the space station to pick up the next group of people.
Very different from, I think, the traditional view of spaceships, because we tend to view them as like, Star Wars or Star Trek, where things, speed up and slow down all the time. This sounds much more like you would have something that's built effectively like a giant bus that would like travel these kind of, direct sort of arcs, and you would have them going backwards and forwards regularly, which means that you would effectively lower the cost and the frequency of being able to travel, lower the cost and increase the frequency, of being able to travel, say, between here and the moon. So, you would catch up to the local one, connect to it, it would go, and then maybe come back. But if you missed that one, there would maybe be another one in a few hours, right?
Right. There's definitely that aspect of it, but the biggest aspect of it is a transport shuttle doesn't need huge life support systems for a couple days worth of travel. It needs just a couple hours. So you're speeding up something that is the size of a school bus and docking with something the size of a cruise ship. Now you could take the true spaceship and speed it up and slow it down and dock it to the space station, but that would be a waste of energy. That's a waste of resources. You want it to stay in a continuous loop back and forth between destination to destination, because you now don't have to speed up and slow down that mass and use energy fruitlessly.
That sounds amazing. And then, we also have those things would obviously carry people, but I imagine they would also carry freight as well, right? Supplies and things.
Absolutely. So it would be essentially carrying resources like any kind of food that the lunar settlements can't produce for themselves, any kind of particularly manufactured things that Luna can't do for itself. And until Luna can do those things for itself, the shuttles back and forth, we'll call them shuttles because that's essentially what they are. They're shuttling freight and people back and forth. These true spaceships can take that stuff to Luna and then drop that off and pick up stuff from Luna directly off of that space elevator that I was telling you about. So with the space elevator, it takes everything to a high enough point above Luna, so you fill up a box at the bottom on these space elevators, and you pick it up and you carry it all the way up the space elevator, and it takes it to a far enough point away from Luna, out of its gravitational well, that essentially all you have to do is push the freight off the side of the elevator at the top, and that gives it enough momentum to fall around Luna in lunar orbit. So put a small booster on that so that it can boost up to speed and catch up with the freight runner, the shuttle that I was talking about. And then the shuttle drops off some material, takes that back to the elevator, that boost over to the elevator, and acts as a counterweight then to pick things up back up the elevator. So you're setting up kind of a conveyor belt of stuff to Luna and stuff from Luna to Earth as a resource transfer that takes away that energy that you would have had to expend to get those up out of gravitational wells and move them from one place to the other. And you're just making the system as efficient as possible. And by doing that, and bringing these quote unquote rare earth resources back to Earth, you can bring down the cost of living here on the ground and make it cheaper to go to space. So you're burning the problem candle from both ends here. You're making it cheaper to go to space so that it's easier to get materials, and then it's easier to get materials to bring back to Earth to make the situation on Earth better so that you can make it cheaper to go to space. You understand?
Yeah, no, I absolutely get that. I mean, I'm sure like this probably is like completely new as a way of thinking about like going to the moon. Like we always talk about going to the moon and settling there, and people are like, well, what is on the moon? I mean, obviously, you've mentioned it. There's a lot of natural resources there. You can mine there, and I think we're talking about setting up factories there as well, like taking the material that's directly there and building from it, right? Large scale material production, I think, is the correct term. But not just that. If we are actually capturing, say, asteroids from other parts of the solar system, near Earth asteroids, for example, like it makes no sense to try and bring them to Earth inside the gravity well where we have to worry about them and trying to deal with them there. Why not just bring them to the moon, where frankly they'll be a lot lighter, a lot easier, a lot more manageable, and you'll be able to get way more bang for your buck for each kilojoule of energy that's spent in taking them apart, smelting down the particular ores that you get, separating out the metal and stuff. And then, as you say, the space elevator would make it much easier for us to be able to shift that stuff up into orbit, and then it would be collected by those true spaceships, right?
Right. Well, essentially, the things that you're doing you in this type of system, you never want to take things from the top of a gravitational well to the bottom of a gravitational well. No matter how easy it is to get it back up out, you want to avoid that as much as possible. So with things like asteroids, we would go after some of the smaller ones and bring them back, but the amount of energy that it takes to go out and change the direction of an asteroid and put it into a certain point and then waste certain points that I'm going to talk about on smaller asteroids is essentially the same amount of energy that it would take to put a really big Mount Everest sized asteroid or meteorite into Lagrange points. And so instead of taking it to the moon and putting it in orbit around the moon or bringing it down to the surface of the moon, you can take these big mountain-sized asteroids and put them in Lagrange points between, let's say, the Earth and the Sun, or the Earth and Luna, or the reverses of those Lagrange points. So we have a select few of those around our system right now that we can set things in them, and essentially it takes no energy to move them, or it takes no energy to keep them in that position, because gravity from, let's say, Luna to Earth is equalized at one point somewhere in between the two of those.
That's right.
Now, that means gravity pulls on it in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably surprising for a lot of people that there is an actual term for that spot, where, the attractive force between Earth and the moon is equal. But of course, it makes sense. The moon has its gravity, Earth has its gravity. So somewhere in the middle, those gravitational pulls will equalize and something is able to just genuinely rest there, right? And it'll stay inside that location, orbiting alongside the Earth and the moon together in like perfect harmony. You're right. It makes no sense to try and drag it away from that, because you're going to have to end up dragging it back up to something like that anyways. So why bring it down? Bring it down to the moon, right?
Right, and the whole point behind bringing asteroids and meteorites to Lagrange points like that is essentially you're getting a secondary moon when you do that, and it's a stationary type thing, so it's easy to dock with, it's easy to reach, it's easy to go to, you always know where it is, you can build infrastructure around it. You can actually build infrastructure and put it all in place, like solar reflectors and things that point directly back to that area, before you actually get your material in that point, because we know where it is and where it's going to be. So it's like a staging zone, and one of the most amazing features of it is you can essentially manufacture or smelt or do your mining or whatever it may be, and clump that stuff together, wrap it up in an aerogel wrapping that can survive re-entry or some other form, whatever is deemed fit and technologically available. Wrap it up and just kind of push it off the side of the asteroid or meteorite, and it will fall into whatever gravity well you push it towards. Because essentially you're balancing, the Lagrange points are balancing points on the edges of two wells, and when you push something to either side, it falls all the way back to that one thing. So you can push this material essentially with like a catapult and send it back to Earth, and now you're sending materials back to Earth for little to no energy at all. You don't even need an elevator.
See, what I love about that is you have a mixture of high tech, the stuff that we've achieved quite recently, alongside a mixture of what we would regard as being very old, reliable tech, right? Because physics is the same, throughout all space and time. Or at least I hope it is. I haven't been throughout all space and time, man.
But that's another horrifying conversation for another day.
Yeah. Let's keep it focused. But so okay, we've got all this like infrastructure up there, and right now I'm pretty sure everyone's wondering, well, what's the point of all of this? It sounds grand, it sounds great, but we would rather spend money on people at home. Like, what do we actually get? Like, what are the goods? What are the services that we actually get? Like, what's going to be wrapped up in this aerogel that's actually worth our while?
Okay, so the benefits of this is, like I hinted at earlier, with the rare earth materials. The more rare earth materials you bring back to Earth, the less rare they are. So with the price of lithium-ion batteries. So lithium is expensive because it's considered a rare earth material. If you find one asteroid or meteorite made up of 25% lithium, but it's the size of two Mount Everests stacked on top of one another, and you disassemble the entire thing and send that lithium back to Earth, you've now essentially doubled the amount of available lithium for manufacturing, and you've cut the price of batteries, lithium-ion batteries, in half.
Wow.
And so you can now build more advanced technologies that require these advanced materials cheaper, so that you can get it to the people cheaper to bring up the class of life. And
it sounds to me like the people that do this kind of stuff are going to be incredibly wealthy, because they're going to be bringing things that are in desperately short supply on Earth, and they're going to be able to do this in a way that makes human progress accelerate massively. So I imagine that there's going to be a lot of interest in doing this kind of stuff, like not just for like those particular sort of raw materials, but also perhaps you can create things specifically up in space which doesn't have any gravity, like zero-G goods and things like that. Is that something that we could make like uniquely up there, or is it just the same as what we would make on Earth?
Oh no, absolutely. So one of the fatal flaws with solar panels is when you're growing the crystalline structure that actually makes up the solar panel part. It has small crystalline structures that are microscopic, that reflect, or even atomic, that reflect light away from the solar panel, thereby decreasing its efficiency. But if you were to build those same solar panels in space when you're growing the crystals, because there's no gravity to pull those molecules as they harden into kind of wonky shapes, you get a more uniform crystalline structure, and you get more powerful solar panels from that. So there are certain advanced materials and technologies that require either vacuum or low gravity to be processed and manufactured correctly. And as of right now, most of those materials, if they're made down here on Earth, they're some of the most expensive things we have, because I don't know if you've noticed lately, but we have a lot of gravity and we don't have very much vacuum.
That's, yeah. That's a conversation for another day. But no, yeah, it makes sense. And I also know that when we're creating medicines, for example, or culturing cells, gravity has an impact on the way in which cells clump together as well. I mean, I know that there's a promising line of research in terms of zero-G medicines, because we know for a fact that DNA and other structures are pretty much crystalline structures, and that it's possible to do a lot more with them in zero G. In fact, that's one of the main benefits that came out of us having the ISS space station in space for such a very long time. And yeah, it's a proof of concept, but as we go and create more infrastructure, not just in the orbit, but also in the moon, we'll be able to do a lot more stuff with it. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. But I wanted to go a little bit further afield. Like, because we're going to have access, say, to a lot of this raw material and stuff, we're also going to have, I think, the potential after we grow these solar panels to be able to, have access to a lot more power, right? We could develop large solar panels, large solar arrays in space. We could develop, power satellites, those kinds of things, and then that'll give us what we need for large scale production of things, maybe on a scale that's unheard of down here, because we are going to have
Right.
infinite space, infinite power,
Right.
and well, I don't know infinite resources, but definitely a lot of resources.
Right, nothing is infinite, so it's more sustainable because there's just so much more of it in space that we won't have to worry about the limited availability of the said resources. So with that amount of power, though, with great power comes great responsibility. That same solar array that you just built, if you slap a microwave transmitter to it, or a microwave, essentially laser, to it, you can beam down power to ground stations, and in the same way that a Tesla tower works, you could beam down that power on top of a Tesla tower and generate large amounts of energy in select areas. You can focus that down and turn it into a death ray, an invisible death ray that kills all living things on the planet as well. So
yeah, let's maybe try and keep it peaceful.
but these are the kinds of problems that you're going to end up running into.
Yeah.
And they have to be addressed before we go up there. So it's not something to be scared of. Being scared of something like that is the equivalent of being scared of other countries having armies. We've always had armies. We've always had weapons. We've always had terrifying things. But we choose not to hurt one another, whether that be from fear of being hurt ourselves or whether that be from human decency. It's not for me to say. But when we get into space, we're going to have a lot of problems that we start running into, and we have to be able to address them before they become problems.
Do you mean problems of like avoiding conflict or defending oneself from conflict? Because again, these are going to be massive sources of wealth, and there's going to be a huge dependency as these things develop, because we're going to be passing down energy to Earth, peacefully and safely. We're also going to be sending down resources to Earth. I mean, the countries and the nations and the individuals that start to take advantage of this stuff first, and to be able to do this for the benefit of humanity. I mean, these are going to be sources of incredible wealth, right, and incredible power. So there's the potential that these things might also be targets, right? So what are the kind of things that we could do to defend, against these things being compromised, do you think?
So down here on Earth, we really don't need to worry about space-based weaponry being used against us, because for one, we have a force field. We have our atmosphere, we have the electromagnetic field, so anything just slightly out of lunar range is going to have a lot of difficulty with any kind of energy weapons at us, or energy weapons or kinetic even, because of our atmosphere. But more so, the people in space have to worry about the people on the ground, because it takes one pinprick to pop a balloon, and essentially everything that's up there is a balloon in some way, shape, or form. Everything is docile up there. Everything is vulnerable. So that isn't something we really have to worry about. And I hear a lot of people quoting that, like, oh, it would be just too catastrophic to put things like that into space because it takes one rogue astronaut. Well, that one rogue astronaut can be easily dealt with before any problems occur. And by having advanced technologies in space, you don't have one rogue astronaut controlling systems like that. For the same reason that you don't have one person controlling the flood release of a dam, and you don't trust people that are prone to actions like that with the flood release of a dam.
I mean, it's kind of fascinating that the ISS has been in space for so long, and it's involved cooperation between people that may have their tensions on Earth, but when they're up in space, I think they realize that their primary enemy is not each other, but the hostile environment of space. And they know that, they have to rely on each other, and that if they do alienate anybody up there, it's a lot more, consequential. It makes a lot of sense that people would, I think, try and avoid conflict for as much as possible. But I am aware that, for example, America has recently developed a space force, and they've declared their intention to be dominant in space, and to protect their resources and national interests in space as well. And some of the things that they could do to defend themselves are, I don't know, I think they're a mystery to people. So I think it's definitely going to be worthwhile talking about defense and aversion of conflict. I think that would be quite useful.
Absolutely, and I would just like to say one thing. We could talk about an imaginary world where everybody's a scientist and we all work together because space is a beautiful frontier. Or we can talk about the reality of the situation where every nation on Earth that has a presence in space, when they realize how much potential for power and for materials and for energy is there, they will do everything in their current power to protect it and to accumulate it. And that's something that we have to be very wary of, because if we start laying claim to things that we cannot control, it will create so much conflict later on down the road when certain colonies and certain groups of people that become self-sufficient or group-sustaining in space decide to essentially secede from the world and become their own organization and group. What kind of rights will those people have? What will be the politics that dictate what is going on with them?
Yeah.
And what we decide now, they will be a reflection of. So if we militarize space now, you'll see a militarized space from now to the end of time, unless something absolutely astonishing happens. So we have to be very careful about the decisions that we make in that spectrum right now, because of the butterfly effect it can have later on in the timeline.
I mean, I think that's definitely something we need to talk about. I mean, we can call it orbital politics or space politics, or, but it's going to be in the future of humanity. I mean, I don't imagine that taxation is going to go away anytime soon, or, what the rights are for, say, the individual, or, for corporate or governmental bodies up there. But there's a lot to be said, I think, there. So, yeah, I mean, what happens if one party decides to revolt, for example, or you have multiple parties claiming ownership of a particular resource? One of the places where we started was the idea that, I mean, maybe I was being far too optimistic in saying that, yeah, there's enough for everybody, and, it's going to be infinite this and infinite that. But you make a very good point. I tend to be very optimistic, and it's important to be realistic about these things and to think about how people are genuinely going to solve those problems. We're not talking about science fiction and Star Trek. I think we're talking about the reality of what it will be like to build this stuff, what the challenges are that we're going to be facing, and how we come together as people. and it won't always be in happy circumstances to be able to solve these problems. So I think, yeah, we should definitely devote a bit of time to that in the future, and maybe try and be as optimistic as possible, but definitely be as realistic as possible as well. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here. I imagine us taking at least like 6 or 7 episodes already, like to discuss this, and I think we'll go through each of them. But like, let's talk a little bit about like the future sort of expansion of humanity, like beyond just the moon. Like, it's kind of astonishing that we've spent this amount of time, and we really are just talking about what it gets, about just getting to the moon, back to where we were. What about
Right.
beyond that? What happens?
So after the moon, the most logical next place to go is not another gravitational well. You want to steer clear of all of those until you have a very sustainable resource grid in space. So, like most people would assume, I would say Mars or Venus next, but those really aren't the best candidates because they're so resource intensive. It takes so much to actually do anything there. Because the best way I've ever heard it put is Mars is colder and drier than all of Antarctica. And I don't see anybody living in Antarctica that's not a scientist. and it just takes so much resources to do things like that, even here on Earth, without any big infrastructure. So with a mediocre infrastructure like we will have after we start expanding away from the moon, the most logical next place to go is definitely going to be the asteroid belt. And we've kind of already poked around inside of it and keyed up on some asteroids that we kind of like and that we are planning on doing certain things with, and maybe we've even started some mining operations, research stations out there. But I'm talking about serious investment of resources and energy into the asteroid belt. So that may involve bringing those asteroids back to Earth, or that may involve spinning them up and turning them into dust clouds, and then taking those dust clouds and picking out the metals and things that you want from them, and creating mirrors in the asteroid belt to actually build somewhat of a laser highway around the inner solar system so that you can build stellasers. It's a larger form of the laser we were talking about back around Earth, but it's in orbit around the sun, very close to the sun, with 2 separate satellites.
So I just wanted to talk about what a couple of those terms mean, because obviously some of our people who are listening to this will know what stellaser stands for, which is basically a stellar laser, a laser that's up in space. It gets its power and source either built in or from somewhere else, maybe beamed in from a power satellite, and converts that into a laser, which you can then use to give impulses to things with solar cells, right? Very much like we were talking about earlier on. Or for example,
absolutely, but in a much larger scale, because the stellaser actually uses beams of certain frequencies of light to the actual wave function, or the wave of the light. Excuse me if I use the improper terms. I'm not a technical, or I'm not an expert in this field, so please don't eat me alive. But it uses the waves of the laser to actually catch, I think they're ions in the sun's upper atmosphere. And you have 2 satellites pointed at one another, shooting a laser back and forth, that then catches those ions and ionizes them into very powerful lasers at the sun. You can set up 2, maybe 3 of these, and then have mirrors in the asteroid belt that bounce that light back, or maybe reflect it back. And you can use those to not only push things away from the sun with solar cells, you can use them to slow them down. You can use them to back things up or move side to side. And now you can essentially go anywhere in the inner solar system at great speed for little to no energy costs and no weight cost on your on your ships.
When I think of really powerful, large-scale lasers, for some reason I imagine the term that you used earlier, which is, death ray. Wouldn't lasers of that sort just punch a hole through the different ships, or cause them to explode, like Star Wars style?
If you didn't have the correct shielding, if your ship is mirrored on the outside and has insulation around the outside of it, which essentially you're going to have anyways, you can do away with that by putting a shield around your ship, and then your entire ship becomes a solar cell in a sense.
Oh wow, okay, that's interesting. So
right. You mentioned it earlier. The program, it's called Starshot, of sending a small, ultra small probe to Alpha Centauri. The actual speed of that is I think it's 1/5 the speed of light before it leaves our solar system. I know, right? So, and that's based on current technology. That's a ground-based laser array that focuses the lasers into 4 shapes. And that little probe actually doesn't have a solar cell on it. It is a solar cell. It has a very reflective coating on it with insulation underneath it so that it doesn't burn up under, like you said, the death ray of the lasers being pointed at it. But you can actually speed it up to, I think it's 1/5 the speed of light, and it would reach Alpha Centauri in approximately 20 to 50 years.
And one of the interesting things there is that I don't think there's going to be another laser at the other end to slow it down, so it'll be shooting past, that entire solar system in pretty much quick time, right? So
right. It would actually look very similar to something that happened here recently. Do you remember?
Oumuamua, you mean?
Yes, absolutely.
For those that don't know, Oumuamua was this rock that was very large, almost cylindrical. We knew it was kind of red shape. It was this object, right? And we assume that it's a rock, and it's pretty much 100% certain that it's an asteroid, right? But its trajectory was so weird that when we calculated, where it had been and how it had traveled in the past, we realized, much to our shock, that it actually had come from an entirely different solar system. So for a while we were wondering, how cool is this? What is this? What could it be? It's very unusual. Could we maybe, send something out to connect with it or whatever? But by that stage it was going way too fast, and it was far too close to the sun, and it kind of slingshotted back out, and we were like, bye-bye, Oumuamua. But it's obvious that, it wasn't the first visitor from another solar system, and it probably won't be the last one either. But we're not talking again about science fiction, about sending things from one solar system to the other. People think of space as being vast and empty, but there's a lot of activity in space, and we have stars that move relatively close to each other. 4 light years is pretty much on our doorstep, right? And it's quite a complex system as well.
So Alpha Centauri is part of if I'm remembering this correctly, Alpha Centauri is part of a local star cluster that our star, which is technically a wandering star, is just passing through. So we're actually getting I don't know if we're getting closer or further away. I can't remember exactly.
What you're saying is that we're an immigrant, basically, into this.
Yes, we're moving relative to this local star cluster, and in a few billion years from now, we will completely be separate from them and off on our own by ourselves. So this is actually a pretty good time to be a sentient race that's capable of interstellar flight, because we can send things into these star clusters, or even much later on down the road inhabit those star clusters and spread out that way using drifting stars in the same way that I don't know, there's not many things to compare that to down here on Earth.
So I think we could talk about that, I think, in one of those episodes as well. Like, so far we've got like 7 or 8 episodes. One of the things that you mentioned there was the belt, the asteroid belt. And that's the belt that exists between the rocky inner planets, basically Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. And then we have these like large sort of, asteroid belt that encircles the sun. And then beyond that, you have the larger gas planets, right? Starting with Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, etc., right? And Uranus, obviously. Sorry, Uranus and then Neptune. Ah, sorry, let me try that again. Jupiter, then Saturn, then Uranus, and then Neptune is like way out there, big blue. And yeah, so I mean, within that asteroid belt, you have literally trillions of objects. And
Right.
yeah, I think
There,
that's part of the
there's
expansion, right?
absolutely there's not technically enough material there to make up something around the size of Mercury. If you were to collate it all together, I can't remember how big it would be, but I know it would be smaller, or about the same size as our moon. So there's a lot of material there, but it's already all broken up and easily accessible to us, so that it's much easier to mine. And you can select certain asteroids that have aspects that you want and make things like O'Neill cylinders, like you hinted at earlier, and bubble ships and bolo habitats. And by creating these things, you build the infrastructure to not only live in space, but travel around space separate from any gravitational well, and have self-sustaining ecosystems and colonies in space separate of any gravitational well government.
I mean, that's amazing. Like the thought that we would spread out in almost like a kind of gas fashion, or a kind of swarm fashion into those places is it's going to be interesting, I think, to discuss and talk about. And I think as we go through each of these particular episodes, we'll put in a lot of work to try and understand these things clearly and to try and express them much more clearly. Here, I think our main purpose is to give an overview of the kind of things that we could talk about, and there's a lot there. So, like as you say, I mean, it's mostly going to be smaller objects inside the asteroid belt, and we're going to maybe forgive me, but I think it's mostly things like ice and rock, right, in there.
Yeah, well, there's still all the rare earth materials that we were talking about earlier, but it is a vast majority ice, rock, or ice and carbon, and that's exactly what we want. Those are the two most useful resources we can find in outer space. Eventually, that's what we will be hunting down 90% of the time, because to live, you need water, period. To make fuel, you need things like hydrogen and oxygen, which is water. And to continue to exist and expand in space as carbon-based life forms with carbon-based food, carbon-based materials that we live with, you need lots of carbon in space. And it makes it very convenient that we have it chunked up into small bite-sized pieces that we can process readily as needed, rather than cutting up an entire planet and trying to turn it into something like an asteroid belt.
And one of the things that fascinates me most, I mean, just from my own background in computing, is that it's a lot colder out there, right, than it is, say, when you're in the inner solar system. So you get much greater bang for your buck in terms of computation. So, it's possible that we may end up like setting up systems, I don't know, like on Titan or in other places where you'd have a large amount of supercomputing that goes on. But again, I think that's just a bit of an aside. One of the things that fascinates me is that we've gone from the Earth, we've gone into space, we've gone to the moon, we've decided that we don't really want to hang around, and kind of get trapped in gravity wells and stuff, and we've kind of skipped over Mars, right? And we've gone straight to this. But I think once we're at that stage where we have that, level of like maturity, I mean, would that be a good time to think about, say, colonizing some of the planets? And how would we do that? Like, how would we, for example, take on Mars or Venus or something?
Okay, absolutely. So we'll start with everybody's golden child, Mars. So once you get the infrastructure and the colonies and the people and the manpower and the manufacturing capabilities,
automation, decentralization,
automation, and decentralization, because you really don't want to inhabit other planets with governments from back home, because you can end up with all kinds of scenarios that don't work out well for the people living in bubble habitats on the surface of the planet. So once you get to that point, you can get things like colonies and groups that collaborate together in some fashion of organized government that orbit these planets, that consider themselves inhabitants of said planet, though they might just be orbiting around it and working remotely on the ground. So in the same way that we were traveling away from Earth by building infrastructure in Earth orbit, low Earth orbit, with drones and robots from the ground, we're now doing the reverse on other planets and making them more livable and habitable without the risk of death and destruction in building these habitats when there's not that infrastructure on the ground. So you can now use your infrastructure that you've created to make these planets livable in a timely fashion, in a focused and narrowed kind of idea of what you want. And you can change that planet, whether that's bioforming, terraforming, technologically adapting to, or whatever it may be, whatever that group deems fit. At that point, you can start moving down into things like Martian gravity wells. Not that I would ever suggest you really need to do that, but there will be people that want to.
I'm a romantic, so yeah, I know it might cost us a bit to go down to those gravity wells and back up again, but damn it, I would want to be able to walk on places like Mars. I would want to be able to, surf through the clouds of Venus. I would want, at least some kind of feeling that I'm actually not just looking down on another world, but actually taking part in it, I don't know, maybe that's just me. But I think we have different philosophies and hopefully go on.
Right, and you kind of hinted on it there, the next one. I'm more of a romantic, not when it comes to the cold, barren, lifeless wasteland that is Mars, which I believe Mars should be turned into like a nature preserve to preserve the actual information that is in its billion-year-old surface. And I would rather turn my attention to terraforming or para-terraforming in a sort, places like Venus, because Venus is a very, very interesting planet. It's the hottest planet, even though it's the second from the sun. Mercury is not even as hot as the surface of Venus because of its thick atmosphere. And that thick atmosphere is what would just make it so easy to live there. And that may seem absolutely crazy, because if you stand on the surface, it's the equivalent of standing on the bottom of the Mariana Trench here on Earth. It would crush you like near instantly. Not to mention the atmosphere at that level is mostly acid. So you can't really build things on the surface of Venus, but you can send a sort of probe about the size of like a bus. And it comes in and it aerobrakes on the atmosphere, which is, again, something that's very difficult to do around Mars because lack of a strong atmosphere. But with Venus, you can aerobrake across the atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, and slow down into an orbit, and then slowly lower yourself down into the atmosphere, continuing your orbit by scooping up atmosphere and filtering out the heavier atoms and the heavier materials, and ending up with a balloon that you blow up as you gain these lighter materials, or these lighter gases, and essentially make a giant zeppelin. And it slowly comes down until you reach an equilibrium point where the inside of the Zeppelin balloon part is the same pressure as the pressure here on surface or on ocean level of Earth. And you can make the atmosphere inside the balloon the same atmosphere that's here on Earth. Now, if you did that here on Earth, your balloon would fall down to the surface. But if you did that on Venus, it would fall down to the level of the atmosphere, which is slightly above regular surface pressure here on Earth. So you would still be up in the air, which actually turns out on Venus to be right at the top, or the slightly below the top of the level of clouds, thick sulfuric acid clouds. So you would have a floating dome directly above the acid storms that are underneath you. So at that point, you can do a number of different things. You can start filtering out CO2 from the air and getting oxygen and carbon, and taking that carbon and pumping it, or even just the CO2, pumping that into your balloons, and then planting seeds like bamboo or something that changes carbon dioxide into oxygen and carbon in plant form very rapidly, so that you get a breathable atmosphere with plants inside, all before humans even get there. And then to generate... Go ahead.
So we're talking about, I'm just trying to get this in my head. Are we talking about a balloon that's the size of, say, a football stadium or bigger?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
Whatever your technology is capable of, you can make it that big, however big you want to do it. And then, however big that ends up turning out to be, make 2 of them, and then 3 of them, and then 4 of them, and then link them all together with walkways in between them and little airlocks and such, so that you can travel in between them. And essentially, you could make huge gigastructures, floating cities in the clouds of Venus, all the while terraforming the ground underneath it by pulling CO2 out of the ground to feed, or out of the air, to feed to your crops, which you're growing now inside your self-sustaining colony, that you didn't need to change the planet in any way, shape, or form to do.
So it sounds like you would send, I don't know, one of these spaceships into orbit around Venus, and it would send down these probes and maybe, send down the occasional, I don't know, small automated robot, very light, which would be able to do some of the linking up, right? And then you'd be able to test and make sure that the thing was secure and safe before the first person wandered in. Would that be the kind of thing we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And
wow.
it still comes with its own negative side effects, where you're living in a bubble that's floating above a hellscape planet. But there's people that want to literally live on the surface of a hellscape planet called Mars.
I mean, I've lived in worse cities, let's be fair, as long as the, I mean, it's relatively low crime, the views are great, I mean, okay, there's not much to do there, the internet and the mobile will be a bit crappy, but, it'll be fine. We'll work it out. It's a place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And so expanding on from there, I mean, at that point, once you've got that infrastructure and that sustainability and just the amount of societal progression, everything from that point forward becomes very speculative, because what we've just kind of described here is all technology that's well within our grasp and well within our capabilities. And it might just be a little ways out, but so was the James Webb telescope when they started building it. So why not start building it? And then
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
So after all that, so you've been building all this infrastructure and such, and solar collectors and giant solar farms and energy satellites and different things like that. And as you build these things, and even the O'Neill cylinders, the Bolo habitats, and different things that you built from the asteroid belt, the more you build of these, the more energy you're actually catching from the sun, because you're creating more livable surface area and more solar collectors, energy collectors that collect energy from the sun. At a certain point, you will cross the threshold of how much light hits the surface of the planet Earth.
Right.
And when you cross that point, you actually become a class 1 civilization. And I do believe that we could essentially, if our lives are extended by just a little bit, you could see that that transition within 1 to 2 lifetimes.
I mean, okay, when you're saying class 1, I think it makes sense to people that understand what that means. But just for the sake of those that don't, could you tell us what a class 1 civilization means?
So I don't quite recall the name of the man who invented that class system.
I might be able to help there. It's I think you're referring to, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're referring to the Kardashev scale. Is that right?
Yes, the Kardashev scale. So the Kardashev scale is a classification for civilizations that are becoming larger and more on the scene of the universe.
Yeah.
So when you right now we are not a class 1 civilization. We're nowhere near a class 1 civilization. We don't collect very much energy from our sun. Every form of energy is energy from our sun and our solar system, by the way. Whether that's oil, whether that's burning wood, whether that's rubbing your hands together, it all came from the sun at one point. Anyways, so to become a class 1 civilization, you have to collect and use and utilize the equivalent amount of energy as the amount of energy that hits the surface of your planet.
Okay. So basically you would make use of all of the energy that is being generated by your planet, right?
Or that could be caught by your planet, essentially. Yeah. And then after that, to become class 2, you actually have to catch all of the energy and use all of the energy that your sun produces. And so the scale gets increasingly larger from there.
Yeah, so that's actually something that's been a huge interest of mine. So by wrapping the entire sun with, say, a set of satellites or even O'Neill cylinders, which we talked about, beforehand, you're able to effectively capture all of the huge amount of power output from the entire sun, and you can do a lot of very, very interesting things at that point. But I think, if we have time, we'll touch on that later on. I think the next step up, that's a class 2 civilization, which is one where you're able to capture all the energy that's coming from your star. That's class 2. And then, we have class 3, which is a civilization that is able to capture all of the energy from its entire galaxy, which is astonishing, to conceive. Again, orders of magnitude Absolutely. Much larger. Between 1 and 2 is a huge, huge jump. And actually from 2 to 3 is an even bigger, much more massive jump. So these are unimaginable leaps. But yes, as you say, we would be very, very, very much on the right track if we were able to make use of all of the energy that was available to us on our little planet alone. And I think that would be a great place, to talk about,
Absolutely.
What is speculative and what isn't. And I think that might be one of the things that we try and do towards the end, just to wrap up. We'll maybe have a sneak peek into what we'll think about and what could come next. And maybe if we've discovered some other topics along the way, we might do some follow-up episodes. That seems to be enough to be going on with. What do you think?
Absolutely, and there's finer details on all of the points we've talked about today, but those details are what we are here to discuss, and we need more time to be able to discuss them if you want to get an actual grasp about what is actually going on. And I suggest to anybody listening, do your own research. Mm-hmm. What you're hearing from us is pre-digested information spit out in bite-sized pieces so that you can get a taste of what is real and what is possible, so that we can get rid of the negative connotations that we have, that we have developed as a society or as a race, essentially, against going into space.
I know most people are hopeful about it, but there's this resistance, this reluctance to believe that the promise of space can be fulfilled. But the richest and most powerful people in the world, like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and others, are very much like they're putting all of their, money, and it is a lot of money, on going into space. Like Elon Musk, quite recently, well, he's famous for having launched one of his Teslas into space, which is floating out there. Oh, he's, he pretty much funded and built SpaceX, and massively, advanced our ability to have reusable rockets, and now, he's sending people up on the Dragon shuttle. Whereas a few years ago, it was all almost completely speculation. And much
20 years ago, his entire company was essentially speculation. There was nothing to it.
Exactly.
And in 2 decades, we have gone from dreaming about the possibility of maybe someday going back to space in a real fashion other than low Earth orbit to, in the next 5 years, there will be boots on the ground on Luna again.
Yeah, that would be phenomenal. Not just that, but he also quite recently launched the Starlink array, right? Which gives us access to satellite internet, which breaks the monopoly and the hegemony of, people on the ground. Basically the ISPs on the ground suddenly are like, uh-oh, they can get their internet from the sky now. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they haven't had competition with anybody in the entire time they've existed, and it's almost like they don't really believe that it's going to work or how it's going to work. But essentially, the technology that he's putting up there, if it works in the fashion that is described, it should be as fast or faster than fiber optic internet right now.
Which would be amazing. I mean, I would love to be able to have decent internet, unlimited decent internet, wherever I am. And, frankly, that's something that you want in this modern global age. It's 2020. We shouldn't have to be wandering around with our phone searching for signal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, with giant cell phone towers obstructing every view.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I kind of want to wrap this up. It's been amazing. I'm so surprised that it's gone so quickly. I can't believe we've been talking for nearly an hour and 20 minutes.
Oh my goodness.
I would just want to thank you so much for starting this podcast, and I hope that we the two of us will have a lot of fun crafting these episodes, and I hope that you guys listening will absolutely join us, at least for the parts of the journey that you find most fascinating. This is a story for me about optimism and hope and practicality and fighting back a lot of the challenges that we're facing day to day. It's also a chance for us to dream, and as Alan said, quite well, a chance for us to glimpse at what might actually be upcoming. We're going to talk about the real things that are happening and how they impact all of these different areas. I don't think we're going to go too much into the abstract if we can help it, mainly because I'm very much into keeping real world examples. So we'll try and put this and couch this in terms of real people doing real things in those particular scenarios, because I think for me, I'm a very visual thinker, but I'm also a very concrete thinker as well. And I don't know when the next episode will be, but I think with the level of enthusiasm that we have, we'll try and make it sooner rather than later.
Absolutely.
Alan, I'll give you the last word in wrapping up and signing off. So over to you, sir.
So, just something that I normally say pretty often. All good things come to those who wait, and all good things are worth waiting. So we've waited long enough. Let's get out there.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to stop recording now.